Today, we write the history of tomorrow. Historic decisions only become historic if they are followed by action.
On the east coast of the U.S., so sort of in the vicinity of New York and Washington.
So that's an interestingly vague answer.
Near Philadelphia.
Where about? Specifically?
Outside of the city, like, I mean,
Good evening, everyone. Please take your seats. We're about to begin. My name is Justin Vogt. I'm executive editor of Foreign Affairs magazine. I'd like to thank the ICDS and the conference organizers and Ava for giving me the privilege of hosting what's going to be, I think, a terrific panel tonight. Fiona Hill is a tough act to follow. And we've got our work cut out for us for another reason too, which is that we're going to be discussing a huge part of the world, which, depending on how you draw it or measure it, accounts for somewhere between 40 and 60% of the world's population, somewhere between 40 and 60% of global GDP. So it's a lot to cover in the time that we have. and we're all sort of used to listening to podcasts now, right? And podcasts have this great feature where you can push this button that speeds it up to 1.25 times or 1.5 times. Unfortunately, we don't have that ability. We're not yet, at least. We're not sort of AI enhanced yet. You can't push that button on us. What that means is that we have to be succinct. And I'm going to ask that of our excellent panelists, and I'm going to ask it of you as well as audience members when the time comes to shift to the questions. And I'm going to try to hold myself to it as well. You have the information on our panelists. So I'm not going to bore you with their titles and their bios, but I am going to tell you who's who so you know who they are. First, we have Matt Johnson to my left, Bobo, Akiko Fukushima, Jonathan Miller, and Beck Strating. Is it Strating or Strating?
Strating.
Oh, Beck Strating, you see. Okay, there you go. Beck Strating at the end. 15 years ago, if you'd come here to the first conference, the first Leonard Mary conference, and you told people that you were going to be moderating a panel on the Indo-Pacific, I think you would have gotten some quizzical looks. At the time, that was just not a term that we used. We talked about the Asia-Pacific, or just the Pacific, or just Asia. So, I'm an editor, and language really matters to me. And so when I realized I'd be doing this panel, I thought, I need to figure out exactly where did this term come from. Why is this even a term that I know? I couldn't quite place it. Van Jackson, who is an IR scholar, an American IR scholar, though, who teaches in New Zealand, wrote about this for Foreign Affairs a couple of years ago. And he did a kind of etymology of the term. And he wrote that really it came into usage in Japan first, in around 2007 or 2008, when the then Prime Minister Shinzo Abe was talking about a broader Asia, trying to link the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. This was at a time when Japan was sort of toying with the idea of trying to collaborate more with India to balance against China. In the US, it really kind of took off a couple years later in 2010 when Robert Kaplan's book Monsoon came out. And this was a major driver in the US of people talking all of a sudden a lot about the Indian Ocean. The Indian Ocean was going to be the 21st century arena where everything played out in terms of geopolitics. That hasn't quite happened yet, but it still might. And then, of course, the Trump administration, had its open and free Indo-Pacific concept, which is just an incredible kind of Washingtonese there. And interestingly, the Biden administration, in a bit of continuity with Trump, one of many actually on foreign policy, had put out an Indo-Pacific strategy paper as well, and also the Indo-Pacific Economic Forum, which is one of its main foreign policy initiatives. I want to start with that background, though, by noting that Jackson in this piece took a kind of skeptical take on this, and I want to quote something that he said. He said that the Indo-Pacific became during the Trump era one of the shibboleths of the Trump era. It was a way for insiders to identify who among them was working in service of a larger project of a zero-sum competition with China. This is kind of a polite way of saying people said Indo-Pacific to show that they were on board. And so that kind of raises my editor spidey sense a little bit. And it made me wonder, is this a real thing? Or is this just a kind of piece of policy rhetoric that we use for sort of motivated reasons without even necessarily realizing it? So the way we're going to start today is I'm going to ask each of the panelists in a kind of little lightning round to convince me that Van Jackson is wrong and that I'm wrong, and that the Indo-Pacific is a real thing, and that it has a coherent sort of significance. So we're going to start at the end. Beck, you're going to go first. And I just wanted to keep it really brief, and then we'll jump into the meat of it. So tell me, is the Indo-Pacific real, and what does it mean?
Well, I'm not sure I'm going to do such a great job at convincing you against that, because I'm on board with what Van was saying in the first place. It's great to be here, and thank you to the organisers for the invitation. I'm from Australia, and Australia has been an enthusiastic adopter of and driver of the Indo-Pacific, which I see through the lens of it being a strategic narrative. So some of what you were saying there, I think, really resonates with me, this idea here, that it's about bringing people, bringing states, bringing strategic elites on board, and it's really significant that that we're here, we're in Estonia, and we're talking about this concept of the Indo-Pacific, which we wouldn't have been doing 10 years ago. So whether or not it exists as a strategic reality, whether or not it's you know, there's lots of things that you could argue don't exist. It's very thinly, weakly institutionalized. You know, there are very fuzzy boundaries, as you pointed out before. But in some ways, that's irrelevant because the Indo-Pacific is mapped imagination. All regions are constructed in some way, and as long as it exists in the minds of strategists, then we can say that it does exist.
It's an imagined community.
I hate to sound like a constructivist, but there you go.
Good. Okay. Jonathan, your turn. What do you think it is? What does it mean?
Well, Justin, thank you. And I think going back to your initial point about the intellectual origins of the concept, I think that's really important. You mentioned Japan, Abe Shinzo obviously coming out with this idea, first talking about the confluence of two seas, but it wasn't just Japan. We also had Australian thinkers, we had Indian thinkers. Southeast Asia now, ASEAN has its own Indo-Pacific outlook. So I think this is an important first point, is that during the Trump administration years, which maybe some of us want to forget, the free and open Indo-Pacific, which effectively was plagiarized in many senses from the Japanese, which had its own free and open Indo-Pacific, I think reframed or reshaped the way we think of this concept. But why is it important and why is it a real thing? Is that the old reality, the old framing of East Asia or Asia Pacific didn't respect the modern challenges, opportunities, and threats of the region. So just one of those I'll point to is the maritime security realm. So a lot of strategists in the region will flip the map upside down the way that we usually see it and show the connectivity of maritime security from Taiwan, which of course we're all focused on recently, to the East China Sea and down to the South China Sea. And then of course linking into the Indian Ocean. So for us to think of things in the old way of thinking of it in the Asia Pacific context didn't represent or didn't properly reflect some of the challenges that we face.
So it's a corrective to an incorrect prior model.
Yes.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
Akiko, your turn.
Thank you. First time I was exposed to this term Indo-Pacific was in late 1990s in academic discussion, as a matter of fact. And the background was, as was said, Asia didn't have regional institutions during the Cold War. We had ASEAN, but that's sub-regional. We didn't have region-wide one, except track to PEC or PVEC. But at the end of the Cold War, Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation was launched exactly in the same month of November 1989, when the Berlin Wall crumbled down. Since then, we ended up having so many alphabet institutions, which was dubbed as an Oriental noodle soup by other colleagues in other regions, which I was very much offended. And then came Indo-Pacific, and late Prime Minister Abe took the lead in launching free and open Asia-Pacific, but I do recognize that Australia has announced your white paper ahead of us talking about Indo-Pacific. So I'm not saying I'm not debating here who initiated it, but I look at Indo-Pacific as a new logic of multilateralism. New logic because we didn't start from who's in, who's out. We didn't start from membership. We didn't start from institution. So I look at it as a new logic of multilateralism, minilateralism included, a platform for cooperation for those who share concerns and interests.
Boy, I'm glad we got away from Oriental noodle soup. That's really bad. Progress. Bobo.
As a proud Australian myself, we tend to think of the Indo-Pacific as having, if not necessarily originated in Australia, then certainly popularised by thinkers such as Rory Medcalf and the former head of the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, Peter Varghese, under whom this term became extremely popular. Now, in its original form, it was, as Akiko is sort of suggesting, meant to be inclusive. The problem with the term Indo-Pacific is that it has been hijacked, not just by the Trump administration and now the Biden administration, but by a 9-year liberal conservative coalition in Australia. And so it has come to mean strategic containment of China. In its milder form, it's about leavening Chinese influence with that of India to try and make China less important in the picture and India correspondingly more so. But that's never terribly convincing. I will say one thing about shibboleths. The Asia-Pacific has now become the reverse shibboleth. So you don't see the term Indo-Pacific in Chinese and Russian discourse, because to say Indo-Pacific means you are for containing China, whereas Asia-Pacific is this nice, fluffy, inclusive term.
Balancing.
That's right.
Matt.
So I'm excited because I get to take, in a sense, the other side on a lot of this, which is to say that I think in contemporary terms, the Indo-Pacific is a kind of dialectic, if you will, between two realities. One is the international status quo as it has more or less existed since the Cold War, and the other is the rise and increasing power of a revisionist and regionally influential China. And so I think that really has to be at the background. When we go back to its history in Japanese discourse, starting in 2007, when Prime Minister Shinzo Abe called for an open and prosperous Indo-Pacific, these weren't words being uttered into a vacuum, and they weren't just about exclusivity, because what really mattered in that context was the norms. It was the idea of openness and transparency, and the reason why those norms had to be restated and the reason why they were important is because there was a sense of change and shift coming from the fact that a China that was not necessarily seen as sharing those norms was becoming more widely influential. In terms of how that sort of took root in the United States, I would offer another perspective, which is it starts with President Obama's pivot to Asia. It starts with the idea of a wider Asian region. And then, yes, I mean, under the Trump administration, starting with the secret, later declassified strategy on the Indo-Pacific strategic framework, it became something in policy terms that was much more multifaceted and substantial. But I think what it really means ultimately is the sense that, whereas a lot of capitals around, the Asia-Pacific and around Asia generally had previously looked at China's rise as something that could be dealt with through engagement and saw it as an open-ended question, the direction in which China's continued evolution would take. Really what the Indo-Pacific framework signals now is a sense that liberal values in the region have to be defended. They can't be taken for granted. And so as a basis for trade, as a basis for maritime security, that normative framework really has to be re-embedded. It can't be assumed anymore. And that, I think, is where US and Australia and Japanese and Indian and other stakeholder strategies all sort of moving toward that position.
I'm going to stick with you, actually, because now that we have a sort of, that's actually, I think, taken together, the five of you have given a very good definition of this and a kind of good sense of what it is we're talking about. I want to stick with you, Matt, because I want to ask you, how would you describe Chinese strategy on the Indo-Pacific? We can read the position papers of the Biden administration and the Trump administration. I'm less familiar with whatever the CCP has put out on this, and I'm not sure I would know how to parse it, even if I could find it. How would you describe it? What is China doing in the Indo-Pacific? Is it cajoling? Is it bullying? Is it bribing? Is it doing all of those things? What's the strategy?
Sure. So just hopefully this stimulates some good debate. This is a smart crowd. I've got nerves, because I take the collective intelligence very seriously here. But I think it starts with China's strategy, which is of regional. I mean, let's just put it this way: it's of regional hegemony and it's of displacing U.S. power in the Pacific region. It starts with comments like, former foreign affairs leader Yang Jiechi saying in 2010 at an ASEAN forum that China is a big country, you all are smaller countries, and this is just a reality that you have to accept. That's what I mean by the hegemony part. In 2014, obviously when we talk about regional strategy, there's a lot of focus on Taiwan, but in 2014, Xi proposed what he called a new Asian security concept. And the basis of that concept essentially is a division of Asia into insiders and outsiders. If you were sort of inside of the Asian sphere and you are a country that China feels that it can work with / exert leverage over, then you are an insider. If you are outside of that sphere, it is because you are a country like the United States whose interests China wants to exclude. This has become a sort of multi-faceted, multi-dimensional strategy. Xi's community of common human destiny really began as an Asian community of common destiny, which was an idea that he articulated in 2014. In 2015, you had Xi famously or infamously telling the White House, telling then President Obama that there would be no militarization of the South China Sea. To which that statement has been paid to by the ongoing hardening and militarization of the South China Sea. China's People's Liberation Army released its own statement on security, where China's interests outside of its own sort of near spaces was really at the center of that strategic document. So that's what I would call phase one. That's basically when the sort of new a new stage post Hu Jintao, although it has its origins in that era. Strategic framework was announced. During the Trump years, it was really interesting. That was when I was sort of more attentive to these issues and did some studies basically showing that for all that the US pushed, China did not seem ready or interested in or willing to escalate in kind. And so therefore a lot of the provocations, depending on how you look at it, coming from the White House were managed in a way that did not contribute to escalation. But under the surface during this period, China was I think pursuing full force an effort to incorporate more of the regional economic infrastructure into its sphere of influence through port construction, and with a focus on potentially dual-use facilities in areas like Cambodia or even Myanmar, through its focus on the Sea of Bengal, which I think if we're going to talk about the Indo-Pacific, we can't lose track of what that really means in geographic terms. It's not just the Asia-Pacific, right? So China's version of an Indo-Pacific strategy is actually to look at areas like the Sea of Bengal, to look at East Africa as regions into which China has to begin projecting power in order, as I just mentioned earlier, to protect overseas interests. And that's an important part of the conversation as well. Finally, since the Biden administration, you could say that we've seen a new step forward. So at the 5th and 6th plenary sessions of the 19th Central Committee of the Chinese Communist
Everybody
Party.
got that? 5th and 6th of the 19th.
She basically announced a twofold shift in strategy for China. One was to replace reform and opening with what he called development and security. Yeah. So economic growth wasn't just growth for growth's sake. It was also about economic leverage and being able to use what he called the gravitational field of China's market to further cement its Asia strategy of being able to come to the table with regional peers from a perspective of dominance and strength. And the effects of that were seen in its relations with Australia, in Beijing's relations with Canberra, when political steps that Canberra took to sort of decrease Chinese influence in Australia were met with economic reprisals, which were never announced formally, but basically there was a broad ban on exports from Australia to China. So that was economic leverage and economic coercion. The next step at the 6th plenum was toward a more sort of forward posture vis-a-vis the United States. And in the interest of other panelists, I'm not going to go deep on the text here, but she was basically saying, this is our time to start acting preemptively, or U.S. containment is really going to take hold here, and we're not going to be able to do anything about it. And that message was repeated at the 20th Party Congress and then again at the two sessions meetings, where she finally named the United States as China's primary competitor and addressed containment as an issue that China would have to face and confront.
Jonathan, I want to ask you about that. I want you to pick up on that, because that's an interesting view of Chinese kind of attempts to, as put it in 2010, we're a big country, you all have to deal with it, this kind of dominant strategy. What's the flip side of that? What is the U.S. and / sort of Western approach? And I'm specifically interested, I want to also hear about how India relates to this, because of course, obviously the whole point of smuggling India into this name suggests that India is the big kind of question here. And of course, the war in Ukraine and India's position on that, I think, has maybe complicated the strategy that existed before. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Well, I think, Matt made a good point talking about the origins of the Indo-Pacific thinking with the pivot. Sometimes we get lost in the semantics, but one point I would make is U.S. approach to this part of the world. There's been more continuity than discontinuity. Pivot to the rebalance to the free and open Indo-Pacific. Yes, sometimes we get caught up in the wording, but the equities and the reasons why the United States in economic terms and in security terms cares about this region, I think fundamentally hasn't shifted that much. The second point, and I think this is harking back to a couple comments that were made earlier, and actually the lecture that we just heard, is that the concerns that are shared in this part of the world about the rise of China, yes, China is a trading partner, a key trading partner to many parts of the Indo-Pacific region, but they're not dominated by the United States. This is not the idea that the United States has forced upon the region Indo-Pacific strategies. Countries such as Japan, such as Australia, even ASEAN, which lives in the world of China, and many of them rely on the economic interconnectivity, they have created these approaches because of their concerns. An example I'll often give is Singapore, for example, which has great economic links to China. You have your public forum, Singapore, something that you'd see here, and then you have your whiskey bar, Singapore. Your public forum, Singapore, will say all the nice diplomatic things, but your whiskey bar, Singapore, is terrified of some of the security developments going on in their region, including the South China Sea. So I think that's one important point to start with. As it comes to the U.S. strategy and the success of that strategy, the positive side, I think, is on the security dimensions. We're seeing many of the allies, for example, Japan and Australia, almost being a quasi-alliance at this point in time. So the integration of ally efforts, not just U.S., Australia, U.S., South Korea, U.S., Japan, U.S., Philippines, we're seeing an integration of some of these efforts in what the U.S. is now framing as integrated deterrence. So I think that's a positive sign. On the sort of glass half empty side, it's the economic leg. We have the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and I blame, as a Canadian, I blame ourselves actually for elongating that acronym to the comprehensive CPTPP.
Well, you wouldn't have had to do it if the United States had just joined, right?
Yeah, exactly. You would tell us that we're not accepting the acronym. Pleasures of a big neighbor. But the United States, with their withdrawal from the TPP, has not fulfilled the economic bargain. Right. Yes, there's the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which the United States is now trying to lead on, but frankly, I don't think the region is buying this. It's not a replacement for market access to U.S. markets in the region. So this is the one area where I think the United States' engagement in the Indo-Pacific really needs to focus. Look, on India, very quickly, we could spend a day to talk about how India thinks about this region. Personally, my own view is that where do we need to be focusing our attention and engagement with India the most? I think it's in the Indo-Pacific. By no means does that mean I think that we shouldn't look to have discussions with India, and I think these are happening in the G20 and elsewhere, bilaterally, minilaterally, about the war in Ukraine. But I think the primary focus in Washington and probably in many of the other countries represented here is about making sure that India remains a partner in the Indo-Pacific. That doesn't mean that India is going to join some larger alliance or Asian NATO, but it does mean that India does share a lot of our concerns and does share a lot of our interests. So I think that's the direction that we need to go, not wanting or expecting India to go along with us in every sort of area of diplomacy, but trying to find those areas that are most important to the things that we care about. So I think that's the direction where the United States and many others in the region are going.
I think that's likely what you'd hear in New Delhi too, probably, right? Beck, how does that look from Australia's point of view? You heard Matt talk a little bit about Australia's experience of being sort of on the front end of this. Talk to me a little bit about what it looks like from Australia. Is there in Australia a public forum and an Australia whiskey bar, or is it is it what you see is what you get?
I think what you see is what you get when it comes to Australia, and it's interesting. There's a term that I've heard a few times, including in the previous lecture, America fatigue. That is not something that Australia has. We are pretty dedicated allies to the United States, and we are very intent on demonstrating that we are committed, faithful and dedicated to the US alliance. In fact, the Defence Strategic Review that was released a couple of weeks ago has capitalised the A in alliance just to really underscore the fact that the alliance remains the central pillar of Australian foreign and defence
editing
policy.
matters.
It does, the language matters. But, what we've been talking about here is, the Indo-Pacific is a concept that really has been driven by concerns about China. And Australia is regarded as a bit of a canary in the coal mine for the reasons that have already been mentioned, particularly around the economic sanctions that were imposed in 2020. Australia has been in the Beijing freezer for, over 2 years of having suspended no talks between high-level officials. And that, trying to get Australia and China's bilateral relationship back on track has been, I think, a concern for the Labor government since it came into power in May 2022. And there has been this gradual thaw, which is quite, I think, interesting to observe how that has happened. Possibly would have happened without the Labor government necessarily doing anything. But it has, there has been a softening in the rhetoric. But at the same time, Australia, the new government, has continued on with a lot of the initiatives that Bobo was talking about before under the 9 years of the coalition government. AUKUS, for example. The Labor government is committed to this pact. It released its optimal pathway in March 2023, which outlines how it's going to get nuclear-powered submarines through the AUKUS pact. And arguably, and I'm happy if the panellists want to argue with me on this, but Australia is probably the most forward-leaning on US integrated deterrent strategy. And AUKUS is a sign of that. It's also a sign of the fact that in the past, Australia has taken a pragmatic approach where it says we don't have to choose between the US and China. That is redundant now. Australia has made its choice. It will, it says it will cooperate with China where it can and disagree where it must, but essentially Australia's made its choice. It's siding with the United States, and I think it's pretty fixed on its view of China now.
Akiko, we've been talking a lot about the US, about China, we heard a little bit about India. I wanted to ask you about a relationship that I think, at least in the US, hasn't received a lot of attention until recent months. And it's very important for the region. It's the relationship between Japan and South Korea. And of course, there's been this sort of this move towards a kind of thaw. And I wonder if you can talk about that, because I think in some ways, at least when you talk to people in Washington, they are now increasingly pointing towards sorting that out as being very important for this integrated deterrence and the larger strategy.
As you pointed out, President Yoon of Republic of Korea visited Tokyo mid-March, I think it was March 16th, and he had a summit meeting with Prime Minister Kishida, and they have agreed to cooperate for the future, going beyond history issues. And that happened because of geopolitical situations, because of strategic situations we are in our neighborhood. And they have agreed to resume Kim Dae-jung Obuchi shuttle diplomacy. Shuttle diplomacy means to have summit meetings without formalities whenever they feel necessary. And I was advised last night over dinner that among 3 Baltic states, maybe you don't call it shallow diplomacy, but there are frequent contacts among leaders so that if something happens, they just call or meet and make sure of the intentions behind. And I was told that is very helpful. If I'm wrong, I stand corrected by colleagues here. But that's something that we have started, and Prime Minister Kishida visited Seoul, I think it was May 7th, after his return from Africa. And they had another round of discussions. And it's not only summit level, but security dialogues have resumed, and we have agreed to launch dialogue on economic security, which we need. And this should pave the way for improvement, not making it a temporary improvement, but improvement. And that is effective in promoting security cooperation among US, Korea, and Japan. Korea, of course, is an ally of the United States. Japan is an ally of the United States, which is a cornerstone of our security policy and diplomatic efforts. And having three to caucus amongst ourselves is very important. I think we had 2 telephone conversations in the month of April facing test launches of ballistic missiles by North Korea. Plus, Republic of Korea announced the Indo-Pacific strategy in December last year, and I'm sure we can work together on some issues in the Indo-Pacific with Korea. That opens another door. Plus, we talked a lot about NATO summit coming up in July in Vilnius, and there will be a session on NATO plus Indo-Pacific partners, Asia-Pacific partners, plus EU, and Korea and Japan are members, along with Australia and New Zealand, and that would allow us to cooperate on that phase as well. So this is not only bilateral improvement, but will have more ramifications at different levels.
Sounds like some grounds for optimism on that. Bobo, the one country that we haven't discussed yet that's been on the main subject of almost every other panel is, of course, Russia and the war in Ukraine. And I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about how the war in Ukraine has affected this region, and maybe also vice versa, in ways that we might not see right away.
Well, I want to pick up on a point that Elliot Cohen made in a previous panel, where he linked events in the Indo-Pacific to outcomes in Ukraine. And I want to reinforce that, because I actually think that security in the Indo-Pacific will be strengthened or weakened by how things turn out in Ukraine, and also by the extent to which the West remains steadfast in its and effective in its support for Ukraine. So that's crucial. Now, so far, the course of the war has made, I think, conflict in the Indo-Pacific less rather than more likely, because I think the Chinese have been surprised by the dismal performance of the Russian military. They have been surprised by the unity and resolve of the West. Now, even before Ukraine, I thought a Chinese invasion of Taiwan was unlikely anytime soon. But now I would say that the chances are very small indeed. Now, never say never, but I would say that they have been significantly reduced as a result of events in Ukraine. I think also what the Ukraine war has shown is the limitations and obvious risks of using military means as a tool of power projection. It's just not the best way. And so I think the Chinese have drawn some conclusions from that. It's quite clear that Beijing has been forced to adjust its foreign policy. Now, I agree with Matt. I don't think Chinese strategic goals in the Indo-Pacific have changed. but I think certainly the modalities, the approaches have. I think China has understood the real risks of being associated with an international delinquent like Russia. There's a certain guilt by association. And they've understood the advantages of strategic flexibility. So what have we seen? We've seen a toning down of their, frankly, pretty hysterical wolf warrior diplomacy. We have seen attempts to reach out to the Europeans and also to US allies in Asia. And that includes Australia, because it's quite interesting that, that you've had the Australian Foreign Minister, Penny Wong, visited Beijing in December. You had a bilateral meeting between Prime Minister Anthony Albanese and Xi Jinping at the Bali G20 summit. So clearly there is some degree of thaw. Let's not overstate it, but some degree. We have seen China step up its outreach to the global south. We have seen China generally try to project itself as a good international citizen, not like those Russians, you see, or even the Americans. And we have also seen China distance itself from the worst excesses of Russian behavior, including nuclear blackmail. But, and there's always a big but, a Putin victory in Ukraine could be a real game changer, because what it would do would be to strengthen the Sino-Russian partnership, because Russia's value to China would be significantly enhanced. And it would also embolden China, because they'd think, well, geez, you know, the West showed more resistance, more unity, more resolve than we expected, but ultimately they folded. They got tired. So all we've got to do is to stick it out. Now, can I just say a couple of words about the Sino-Russian partnership?
Sure, please.
Now, I think the big takeaway from the last year is that the war has exposed the limits of this so-called no-limits friendship. It has shown that Chinese and Russian interests are emphatically not the same. And also, I disagree with the conventional wisdom that China has been a net beneficiary of this war. I think China has suffered immense strategic, economic, and reputational damage. I'm happy to go into it later, but let's just put it out there for the time being. I think the war has highlighted fundamental differences in the way that China and Russia view global order. I see China as definitely a revisionist power, but it's a system player. It believes it can work the system from within, and it likes the idea of an order, if only because it doesn't like disorder, but also it has no replacement order to put in place of the rules-based international order. Russia benefits from anarchy and disorder. Ryan Haas at Brookings used the term, Russia is an arsonist of the international system. So what China wants to do is revise the order so that it reflects, so that it enhances Chinese influence and reduces that of the United States and the West. Russia's not interested in revising the world order. It wants to burn it down. Just a couple of more points. Now, clearly China hopes for a Russian victory in Ukraine, but it's not going to intervene on Russia's behalf to try and achieve this aim. It would run against so many Chinese objectives, one idea being that it wants to promote itself as a responsible, good international citizen, and being overly supportive of Russia really jeopardizes that. And finally, I just want to say, well, what if Russia becomes a client state of China? You know, won't that jeopardize Indo-Pacific security? Actually, I don't think so. I think Russia's too proud. I think Sergei Radchenko talked about the cult of greatness. Mm-hmm. The Russians feel themselves as so great, they don't want to be any client state, even if that is perhaps their natural state in relation to China. But they won't accept that. And they won't, they worry about the Chinese. They don't want to burn their bridges. So they want to keep links with, say, India and Vietnam and others. They like the idea of strategic flexibility. And also they recognize that if ever China were to become the regional hegemon in the Indo-Pacific, that opens up all sorts of questions about the long-term future of the Russian Far East.
Right.
I'll finish there.
It's good. You've given us a lot to think about. Jonathan, you had a hand up. Something Bobo said caught you.
Yeah, well, and again, 98% of what Bobo said I agree with. But just one thing I wanted to mention on the implications of Russia's war in Ukraine on the Indo-Pacific. And there's this saying that there's no such thing as a free lunch, and the bill always comes later. So I wanted to dive in a little bit on why, especially we mentioned the AP4, Japan and South Korea, Australia, New Zealand. Pointing to Japan and South Korea in particular, why did they take these steps to quickly sanction Russia and join closely with the rest of G7? Obviously, Japan being a member of the G7. It's not. Don't take that for granted. Japan and South Korea are not traditionally states that very quickly are trigger happy on sanctions. North Korea may be excluded from this. There's two main reasons why this happened. One of it, of course, is the overt, brutal nature in humanitarian terms of this invasion. It was not one that you could be litigious on and say, well, I'm not sure if this crosses the threshold. So I think everyone saw, and Seoul and Tokyo included, that something had to be done. But the second part is very important, and this is why I say there's no free lunch, is that there's an understanding here. There's a contract. It's not a legal contract, but it is a social contract. And I think many of our European friends probably understand this, but definitely need to understand it. If something happens in the Indo-Pacific, whether it's a Taiwan contingency, whether it's something over North Korea, which we haven't mentioned so far today, there's an expectation from those Indo-Pacific allies that I'm not going to name certain capitals, but maybe I will. If it's in Berlin or Paris and people are ducking under the table and saying we don't want any part of a contingency in the Indo-Pacific, that's going to be unacceptable. That's going to break that social contract. So I think that's an important thing to remember, is we all hope that there's not a two-front conflict. We all hope there's no contingency over Taiwan, and no one expects that to be military support, but absolutely economic support. So that is something to keep in mind, that yes, the Asian allies have been gracious in their support of European friends in the war in Ukraine, but there are expectations associated with that.
Yeah, sure. This is why Mr. Macron was in such hot water in the U.S. press recently. Yeah, Akiko, you wanted to weigh in.
I just would like to add footnote to what Jonathan has just said. I agree with his analysis from a Japanese academic perspective. Russian aggression to Ukraine was not something acceptable to Japan because it constituted use of force to change the status quo. In addition to all the appalling things we had to witness, and so through our TV programs, but this act of changing status quo by force or even coercion is something unacceptable. Japan has a northern territorial issue with Russia, which we have been negotiating, believe it or not, over 70 years, and it is still unsolved. And we are very anxious to solve it sooner than later. And we also import energy from Russia, as well as lumber and every other things. But still, this was not something acceptable to our country. Therefore, we decided to act in sync with G7, and Japan is the presidency of G7 this year. People tend to think that chair is only for the summit meeting, but as a matter of fact, now it is for the whole year. And that's something very hard, but trying to lead as well. So a little footnote.
Jonathan mentioned a kind of contingency, a Taiwan contingency or a two-front contingency. Bobo earlier said that he thought that the war in Ukraine has actually reduced the risk of a conflict over Taiwan. Do you agree?
I would just, I guess, jump in on the fact pattern, which is that since, and this is part of the dialectic, since the new invasion of Ukraine, And since the joint statement between China and Russia, Xi has met again with Putin in Moscow. The two of them have laid out a new comprehensive agreement. It didn't mention no limits partnership, but I think that's because the dimensions of the partnership are becoming much more clearly articulated. Now, in terms of implications of, kind of like broader, excuse me, Indo-Pacific issues, those parts of the agreement that I think are most relevant are to accelerate a transformation of global governance that puts China and Russia in the driver's seat through new multilateral fora. And in exchange for Russia's military support, so to speak, of China's overall global strategy, what China's gotten in exchange is full endorsement from Putin for China's own development and security concepts, like the Global Security Initiative and like this new Global Civilizations Initiative that Xi is rolling out, as well as continued cooperation in economic and other areas. Now, then what followed that was in March. What followed that in April was China's defense minister flew out to Moscow on Xi's heels. This is a guy who is a red princeling. He's the descendant of a Yan'an revolutionary. He has Xi's deep personal trust, as far as we can tell. In other words, he's acting as Xi's emissary. And what he did, according to the readouts, is met with Shoigu and with Putin and signed, or at least made agreements to cooperate with Russia at the level of military theaters, military operations, and military technological and educational exchange. And so it's very difficult to see China as backing away from this perspective. What I think is more likely, frankly, which is what makes the analysis really confusing, is that there are many facets to China's management of international affairs. One facet is the conversation among like-minded countries like Russia and Belarus, who are increasingly drawn into mounting a kind of collective challenge to the international status quo of the post-World War II order, post-Cold War order. And that's the conversation that does not make its way into the press very easily, in part because in some cases the documents have to be located, translated, et cetera, which is a plea for sort of more open source analysis. But then secondarily, there's an external messaging campaign, which has no bearing on what the actual intentions of Beijing actually are, except by assuring other capitals that China, is not as caught up in the war in Ukraine as it is actually. That somehow is also good for China's interests because it allows communication, trade, et cetera, to remain open. But what's interesting about that agreement in April is it really went right up. I mean, it's almost like brinksmanship. So if we're in a new Cold War, it's time to bring back, a kind of Cold War vocabulary here. It goes right up to the limit of what is a red line for the United States, which is no direct provision of lethal aid to Russia in the context of the Ukraine conflict. That's the one piece they didn't address. In terms of military cooperation, they addressed everything else.
Yeah, so Matt raises a lot of really interesting points. Let's start off with the idea of transformation of global order. The Chinese talk about, are highly critical of the rules-based international order. They do believe there should be changes in global governance. And yet, here's the paradox. They have been the single greatest beneficiary of the US-led post-Cold War order over the last 30 years. The Russians, by contrast, see themselves as the biggest victims and casualties of this same order. So the Chinese, what they want to do is keep the bits of the rules-based international order that they like, which are clearly economic connectivity, globalization, but also the fact that this order is so loose that there's plenty of room for them to maneuver within it. Now, that still makes them, but the biggest problem the Chinese face with global order is they have nothing to replace it with. Because Xi Jinping's sort of community of shared destiny is just waffle. There's no substance to it. Whereas the US rules-based international order at least has substance to it. You might not like it, but gosh, it's useful. Now, just quickly on why I don't think that talking about the military aspect of it, I don't think China will, I mean, you never say never, you can look like a real idiot when they do it, but I don't think they will provide lethal aid to Russia for 4 reasons. One is clearly the fear of secondary sanctions against Chinese companies, which are far more dependent on trade and investment in the West than they are on Russia, which is frankly a relatively minor player in the overall Chinese scheme of things. The second issue is they want to keep the Europeans on side. The biggest problem, the strategic problem that the Chinese have faced, is that the Ukraine war has actually unified the West as never before. It's given real life and purpose to US-led alliances. And so the last thing they want to do, in a sense, they've given up on the United States. They hate us anyway. But they still think that they have hopes with some of the Europeans. And then they also want to promote themselves as a good international citizen, the peacemaker. Now, we know the Chinese mediation initiative is, frankly speaking, a load of BS. It's nothing. But what it does do is it sends a political message to the world, to the global south in particular, that we are, blessed are, the peacemakers, and we are the blessed here. And I think China generally is trying to sort of position itself as having maximum strategic flexibility. And that means not stepping over that red line of providing lethal military aid. Not because they're worried about alienating the Americans. That ship's already sailed.
No, they're worried about sanctions.
But the other.
Yeah.
And that's really, it's about giving yourself options and choice of strategy. And that's key to China.
Beck, you were nodding earlier. Was there something you wanted to jump in on what Bobo was saying?
Well, I actually wanted to ask Bobo a question about this, going back to that point about being a revisionist power, but without having a model that it wants to implement.
Yeah.
And, this is a panel about the sea. We're talking about the Indo-Pacific, which is a maritime construct. Yeah. And as I said before, I think the Indo-Pacific is a strategic narrative. And one of the key parts of that narrative is that the South China Sea dispute is an exemplar of the ways that China is a revisionist power.
Yeah.
But, I mean, we get back to this issue about this replacement order and the fact that China wants maximum manoeuvrability. And in the South China Sea dispute, this is, it treats that maritime domain differently to how it treats other maritime domains. It wants to limit freedom of navigation for other states, particularly the United States, within the South China Sea, but it wants freedom of navigation rights in far seas for itself.
Yeah. Including in Russian seas, so including the northern Arctic. So
exactly. Yeah. And so the way that it has sought to deal with the South China Sea as a near sea is it has sought to territorialise it. It has done it through the use of domestic law and through privileging domestic law as opposed to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. So what I wanted to ask you, isn't this a form of great power exceptionalism rather than revisionism? And that's about great powers having special rights and responsibilities. And of course, I'm not meaning to suggest that there's any moral equivalence here, but the US has created a bit of a rod for its own back in the fact that the United States can point to it not ratifying UNCLOS.
It's interesting you talk about revisionism and exceptionalism as kind of two separate phenomena, whereas I see them as very closely interrelated. The story that Matt was describing in 2010 was, I think, Yang Jiechi speaking to the Singapore foreign minister and basically saying, as you were describing, that we're big countries, you're small, just deal with it, understand the natural order of things. So, of course, that great power exceptionalism very much exists. In a way, perhaps part of the intensity of US-China rivalry is it's not just about strategic or geopolitical competition. It's not just about norms. In a sense, it's the clash of two competing exceptionalisms. That the Americans and Chinese, perhaps more than any other peoples I know, including Russians, think of themselves as better than the rest. And that is a problem. There's just no room for that really to be massaged. There's always, I mean, maybe you can manage it just. And in a way, people talk about a new Cold War. I wish it were that case, because at least the new Cold War might at least have a certain mutual understanding of the basic laws of coexistence and cooperation and competition. The problem that we face in the world today, and we'll talk a bit more about this tomorrow, is that there are no rules. We live in a ruleless world. And the problem is then great power exceptionalism really kicks in all sorts of ugly and vicious ways.
I think it was it Huntington that said we were going to miss the Cold War? I can't remember
Exactly.
who. Yeah,
No,
right.
he
Well,
wasn't.
so there you go. We do. All right. I want to turn things over to the audience. I'd love to get your questions. I'm just going to ask a couple of ground rules here, which is, first of all, please ask a question. Second of all, if you can, identify who it is on the panel that you'd like to answer it. And third of all, don't make me want to push my podcast speed up button. let's keep it snappy, and let's get a lot of questions in. Okay, we're gonna start with the lady here on the left-hand side.
Hello, I am Heli Tiirma-Klara. I'm Estonian cyber expert here. And I'm struck that you did not mention the dimension of new technologies or anything about this new field. I think that also will impact foreign policy in long run in the future. And my question goes to Bobo. You just said that China is not able to challenge or replace the current international system. I see this attempt in internet governance, in some of the, our more technology-related fields. So my question is, why do you think they cannot do it also in broader terms in the future?
Sure. We're taking bunches of
yeah,
questions.
but why don't we take a couple more, and we'll circle back then. Yeah, the gentleman here in the front.
Thank you very much. Mark Lantane, University of Tromsø. This is an open question. It's a very old joke that if you put two economists in a room, you get three opinions. And we're starting to see that with a lot of dialogue about where China's economy is going. And I think this is also very important if we're going to be talking about strategy in the Indo-Pacific. So I just want to get people's opinions. There's been wild swings in opinion, including just this week in The Economist, talking about potential Chinese declinism. Where do you see China's economy going, and how do you think that's going to affect many of the questions which are affecting the region as a whole?
Great.
Thank you.
Yeah, great question. Yeah, that's good. Yes, the gentleman here on the aisle. Thank you.
Yes, I think for Bobo, but for anybody, where do you see China and Russia's relationship going in the longer term? Is there not some inherent conflicts between the two of them that make a short or medium-term cooperation desirable to both for various reasons? But looking at China and Russia, if I had a very large Far Eastern area with a lot of resources and very few people next to a country that had lots of people that really needed those resources, isn't that an inherent conflict both there and perhaps in other areas, Central Asia and the like? So where do you see the long-term, 10, I don't know how long, but is there a conflict there brewing?
Okay, so we had this kind of question of net governance, right, internet governance, technology, tech governance, the question about the Chinese economy, what's happening with it, and this sort of longer-term question about Russia and Chinese relations. Who wants to jump in first? I think the first one was for you, Bobo, so why don't you go ahead.
So shall I answer the other two as well?
Why don't you pick which one you want to answer, and then we'll
All right,
see
let's
what
start off with the internet governance, because that is a very interesting question. I personally don't think that the main thrust of China's attempts to dominate internet governance is about global projection. I think it's mainly a defensive mechanism as kind of creating a firewall in a Chinese influence zone from seditious Western influences. So I don't think ultimately that the Chinese care what form of governance you have in Africa, Latin America, in much of Asia, so long as they favor Chinese interests. So it's not the principle of governing people that matters. In fact, you'd rather not, because it's way too hard. Gosh, the Americans have tried it and it didn't work. So what can we do without considerably fewer resources? So I see the Chinese really trying to control their, at best, regional environment rather than try to be global players. I still think, in many respects, the Chinese perspective remains a regional rather than global one. Can I just quickly answer the perspective one?
Yeah, quickly, because then I want to get some other panels.
So the perspective one is, right now, the China-Russia relationship is safe because their relations with the United States are so bad and will remain so bad for the foreseeable future that they really only have each other. They need each other too badly. But in the longer term, there are real issues. And the main issue is this, the widening gap between China and Russia in terms of capabilities. And that means Russia, which is really insecure about inferiority, after all, it hated being inferior to the West. How do you think it's going to feel being inferior to the Chinese? That's just quelle horreur, like a really terrible outcome. And then there are specific areas like the Arctic, like Central Asia, and of course the so-called lost 1.5 square million kilometers that were ceded to the Russian Empire through the unequal treaties of the 19th century. These are real long-term issues that eventually will be resolved for better or worse.
Matt, what can you tell us about the Chinese economy question? Because I think that's a really interesting one.
I mean, look, what you'll see in the financial media, I'll just try to go quickly, is that China's economy is under a lot of pressure. The post-COVID or post-zero COVID rebound seems to be petering out. Consumption has not been picking up as expected. Manufacturing has not been picking up as expected. All of this would seemingly put pressure on Xi Jinping to, sort of throw full weight behind older policies of reform and opening in an effort to stimulate some kind of economic recovery. That's not at all what you hear coming out of Beijing. Instead, I mean, I think this point gets missed often. China's economy is still a planned economy. It's not a completely state-owned economy, but it's a planned economy. There's a rigorous, lengthy, very bureaucratically consuming planning cycle. And what this planning cycle now is sort of orienting toward is that Xi Jinping wants the following things. He wants self-reliance in key technologies all the way up the value chain. He wants food security. He wants energy security. He wants an economy that basically is more resilient and more self-sufficient than it's been previously. You could argue that even though China has benefited from the existing order, he's trying to unwind some of the more strategically compromising aspects of globalization as they affect China's national interests. And that's the economic plan. I'm, not clear on where the future goes in terms of can Xi ride out the current economic downturn that he's facing. But none of the policy signals say that he's reversing course. And what this means for the wider region, I think, is a continuity of existing policies, not some kind of like capitulation or effort to re-globalize in more favorable and open ways for other countries. And as evidence of this, you look at what just happened with this counter espionage-driven crackdown on due diligence and economic data providers in China, across China, like multiple locations. It's basically saying to firms, MNCs that operate in China and their governments that you're free to come here and invest, and you're free to operate in our country, but your companies have to exist in some meaningful way within our strategic plan. And what that means is we guide your investment, we guide how you do business. You do business by our rules, And in terms of economic information, data, et cetera, we give that to you. You don't have your own independent providers. And that's an incredibly difficult, for anybody here who's in a commercial space or just understands what that means, this is an incredibly difficult operating environment for any MNC or any chamber of commerce to operate in. It's really a new turn, and it's going much more toward the security end of the spectrum than the development end of the spectrum, and that is going to impact the region as a whole. There have been Japanese nationals, who have been imprisoned as a result of this campaign that I just mentioned. That's an ongoing issue. Japanese and Taiwanese are the most frequently imprisoned national non-PRC people in China, and there's still that coercive element to China's economic diplomacy that is not going away.
So the question is going to become really whether the allure of the Chinese market stays strong enough to keep people playing, even if that's the new rules.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah.
There's no change.
No, that's
okay.
Spot on.
Let's get some more questions. We'll start with the lady here towards the aisle. Yes.
Thank you for the very interesting panel. My name is Lolita Sigan. I'm an international consultant from Riga, Latvia. And if we are thinking about Indo-Pacific region as a strategy, as was suggested, there is a country that I would like to mention, and that is Mongolia. Of course, it's a bit outside the region if we think about it, but it needs a strategy. It's sandwiched between Russia and China, and it's a vibrant democracy. So have you ever heard, is there any strategy for Mongolia? Thank you.
Okay. All right, we've got Mongolia. We'll take the young lady next in the purple here on the aisle.
Agnieszka Nica, Asia Center, University of Tartu. Well, you said a lot that language or editing matters, and we are discussing here the Indo-Pacific region. But I've got a feeling that India has not been covered enough. So I've got like an open question to everyone. How does India project itself to the Indo-Pacific region? Can it serve as anything else than counterbalance against China?
Good. Thank you very much. I agree with you, and I'm glad that you've asked that question. Thank you. And now the last one of this round will be this gentleman.
Thank you, Hiro Akita from Nikkei, Tokyo. So my question is about the Taiwan war scenario. Maybe Bobo thinks that it is unlikely, but the unthinkable thing happened. It's happening in Europe, so let's think about unthinkable. Yeah. So my question is that we all, most of the discussion currently now focus on what will happen if China invade Taiwan. Mm-hmm. But that is just the phase one. And even if China failed to control Taiwan, or even if China successfully controlled Taiwan, this is just move one. So there would be a move two, move third, move four, because China will never give up. It's almost like a war in Ukraine will never end, even if Russia will be kicked out of Ukraine. So my question is that, what will be the move phase two scenario, phase third scenario, phase fourth scenario, if once China's invasion to Taiwan occurs? Thank you.
Okay. The order I want to do this in, I want to start with the India question, and I'm going to leave. I'm not sure who wants to jump in on that, but somebody's got to do it, and it's not going to be me, because it's very important. It's extremely important. It's why that word is in there, as we said. So let's go to that one first. Who wants to take a stab at that?
I'll give it a go if no one else wants it.
Go ahead, Bobo.
Okay. I think with India, it's a really interesting situation because the Indian perception of India's role in the Indo-Pacific is very different, I think, to that of the United States. I think the United States looks at India principally as a great counterbalancer to China. I think Indians, and there are some in the room, and they will no doubt correct me, see themselves much more as an independent center of global power. Now, they're not necessarily irreconcilable, but the emphasis, as you can see, is very, very different. And I wonder whether there will be certain tensions. There's a very interesting piece, actually, in Foreign Affairs by Ashley Tellis, where he basically says that that India will not follow the US lead on China. India will pursue its own independent strategic interests, which may or may not coincide with those of the United States. And it'll be New Delhi that decides that and not Washington.
Yes, he called it America's bad bet on India.
Exactly.
Right.
So I do wonder whether there can be real tensions in that.
Yeah. Yeah. Anyone else want to take a crack on India? Yeah, Jonathan.
Well, not so much in India, but I feel it's my obligation to answer the Mongolia question. I was at the Ulaanbaatar dialogue last June, and we want to talk about difficult geographies. I mean, Mongolia has the impossible geography. And I think it's the reason that they've articulated for a long time, maybe not Indo-Pacific, but the need for a third neighbor. They're desperately trying to escape their geography, find a new friend. But my one reflection from Mongolia, and this was fresh off the Ukraine war, is how betrayed they felt with the war in Ukraine. They have a contentious relationship with China, but I think especially after Russia's invasion in Ukraine, there was a deep sense of betrayal in Mongolia. So there's no easy answers
explain that, though, for those of us who are less versed in this. Why? What's the betrayal?
Well, because of Mongolia formerly not being a part of the Soviet Union, but being a satellite state of the Soviet Union, and feeling that Russia was effectively attacking, one of its own. I mean, again, wrong narrative, but that's what the Mongolians felt. So where Mongolia goes from now, we don't know, but I think that they're desperately searching for a third party. One quick point that I wanted to mention to Akita's point on Taiwan, I think a very good question, but I think I'm going to reframe it a little bit. I don't think we should be looking at the second and third and fourth stages. I think we have to think about the potential that many of these things could happen at the exact same time. So rather than thinking of a Taiwan contingency in isolation and a fishbowl, we could potentially have a clash between China and Japan over the Senkaku at the same time. We don't know Kim Jong-un, what he's going to do in North Korea at the same time that the United States potentially gets involved in a contingency. And as Beck mentioned earlier in the South China Sea, we don't know what's going to happen in the South China Sea at the same point. So I think rather than thinking about these things in isolation and the idea that Taiwan's going to happen and then maybe the next domino falls, I really worry about everything being interconnected, and at the same time we're dealing with 3 or 4 different things. Not to depress the room before dinner, but that's really the thing I worry about.
You know what's funny about the North Korea thing? Beck, you mentioned North Korea, and Jonathan, you have now too, and you said it hadn't come up. Just thinking back, like 4 or 5 years ago, at least in New York and Washington, it was like North Korea was this incredible emergency, we seem to go through these cycles, and then it just kind of, it settles back into a sort of stasis. And I wonder whether that's a very, a Acela corridor way of thinking about this, or whether in the region it's just sort of more of like a constant emergency, and it doesn't really ever go away. Is there a difference in perception there? Because I'm telling you, that's how people talk about it. And we talk about it a lot, and then suddenly it just vanishes. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Beck. Yeah.
I was going to say, just from an Australian perspective,
Yeah.
I mean, a few years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, it was all about the South China Sea, right? It was like Australia was kind of fixated on the South China Sea, even though, like the United States, Australia doesn't have maritime or territorial claims, but it's the symbolism of the South China Sea and what we were talking about. Whereas now, that's kind of faded a little bit. It's still there, but it's all about Taiwan now. And the anxiety for a state like Australia is, it's a sort of twofold anxiety. If, the US is sort of becomes embroiled in a conflict over Taiwan with China, there's the question of what would Australia do? And that's one I think that is kind of plaguing thinkers in Australia, because the opposition leader, Peter Dutton, who was formerly the Defence Minister, came out a few years ago and said it's inconceivable that Australia wouldn't support the United States in a conflict. And I think that's right. Like, I think he said the quiet part out loud. So on the one hand, it's like, ooh, that's a scary thought that Australia could be facing China in a conflict. But the other scary thought is that the United States would abandon Taiwan, because what kind of signal would that send to a democratic, middle-sized country in Asia of around 25 million people? So there's a kind of, I guess, a Janus-faced anxiety that countries, particularly Australia, faces when it comes to Taiwan.
Yeah, well, if you listen to President Biden, has been very clear clear about this. I think, much to his own administration's chagrin, maybe. Yeah, they should be, maybe the Australians can take some reassurance from that, but maybe not. Do we have some more questions? I feel like I've neglected this side of the room, and I want to make sure that I don't. The gentleman here, and then we'll go to the front row as well.
Thank you. Hi, Thibault Mesergue from the International Republican Institute. I find that the discussion that we have seems very exotic for a lot of Europeans because they see this India very far away, Australia very, very far away, China very, very far away. And so I'm the head of the Rome office of IRI, hardship posting inside my organization, of course. And I think the Italians are starting to think how to link up the Mediterranean and the Indo-Pacific. And I feel that not only is it very smart, but we might be a bit late because I think the Chinese have already started thinking about it. If you think about just, where did China build their first base outside of Chinese borders? Just at the entrance of the Red Sea in Djibouti, which is basically the point where what the Italians call the enlarged Mediterranean becomes the Indo-Pacific. So I was wondering, and I think this is something to make it look really real for Europeans. This is an argument that needs to be made. Do you factor in this sort of connection that is linking the larger Mediterranean world, let's say? And again, China, ports, Piraeus, the potentially double-use port that is being built right now in Algeria, the ports that the Chinese are desperate to buy in Italy. Can we kind of, it's very Eurocentric, I understand that, but as we're in Europe, can we build something out of that? So I'm just throwing this out to you. Can we factor that in our conversation? I think that would be useful for the Europeans in the room. Thank you.
Good. Yeah, no, I like that. Thanks. Go ahead, sir.
I wonder how the members of the panel see the importance of the Quad cooperation, the Indian, Australian, American, Japanese cooperation.
Good. Okay, question on the Quad, and we'll take one more. Yes, the lady here towards the aisle here. Thank you.
Rachel Tausenfried from GMF. So this is linking, I think, again, the conversation with Europe a bit. Rebecca mentioned in her last answer something about anxiety. And within the partnership in Europe with the United States, as much as they've also decided where they stand, there is some anxiety about a kind of increasingly robust rhetoric toward China and, for example, the export controls meant to block China from the most advanced semiconductor technology. It was an economic issue for some partners, a pretty severe one, but also there's some worries that these moves are overly aggressive. And for example, in Germany, some people in the government like to point to, they are being in line with other partners in the Indo-Pacific who are also worried about escalation from the US. So if anyone wants to be a little bit critical of the United States in this regard, I think it would be welcome.
Yeah. Okay, good. I like this. This is a good collection of questions. Let's start. I like this idea of an Indo-Pac Mediterranean. Is that like we can just sort of rope? Let's get all the seas and we'll stretch it to the Pacific and the Atlantic, and we can throw the Caribbean in as well. Maybe that'll make it hit home for the Americans. Who wants to take that one? This question of how can, if I understand your question sort of correctly, is how can we? What are the ways in which Europe can understand, or European policymakers should understand this, and I think maybe more importantly, communicate to their voters, their constituencies, their corporations, the importance of what's happening in this. Anyone want to take a stab at that? Go ahead, Akiko.
Let me try. That is a very good question, and that reminds me of my exercise defining Indo-Pacific.
Yeah.
And I believe it was in Australia that we had academic discussions on the definition of Indo-Pacific, geographical definition.
Right.
And we end up having maybe 12 different maps of Indo-Pacific.
Did any of them have the Mediterranean on it?
As a matter of fact, it wasn't quite Mediterranean, but very close to it, because Japanese concept included Djibouti and Horn of Africa all the way to the Pacific. And the importance is the sea lane of communication all the way from Middle East, Africa to Pacific, because that's the trade route for Japan and others in the Pacific. So, and in short, we decided not to have a map of definition.
Right.
Rather,
very good solution. Yeah.
Keep it ambiguous.
Yes,
absolutely.
So that
strategic ambiguity. Yeah.
strategic ambiguity.
Right, right.
So that we, each of us, can emphasize concerns, interest that we have in terms of the sea lane, or, as a matter of fact, Indo-Pacific is not only sea, but includes land.
Right.
Like we talk about a lot about connectivity. And as a matter of fact, I was in Djibouti because Japan has operation base there too, ahead of China, as a matter of fact. And US and European countries have it. Why? Because we are acting together to control piracy.
Right.
And we have been very effective. But I'm told that once we pull out, pirates will come back. So that's a very difficult question of exit strategy. But that's how I understand Indo-Pacific. So coming back to the question about India, India is very important. Western coast of Indian Ocean, as well as the other side, are very important for us. And talking of Quad.
Yes, good. Go ahead, yeah. No, please go ahead. Keep going, because we'll segue into this question. Go ahead.
Okay. Quad is an important process, and it started from Maritime Security Cooperation, but now includes pandemic, critical and emerging technologies, what else?
Climate.
Connectivity, climate security. We have broad spectrum of cooperation. Why? It is important to include four of us together and try to have impact beyond Quad in terms of the outcome. That's how I perceive it.
Agree with that.
Yeah, go ahead, Jonathan. Yeah.
Well, just to build on the point of the Quad, I mean, the Quad, it's a good question. The Quad's important. It took time. This is Quad 2.0, so the first Quad obviously fizzled out relatively quickly. The geostrategic circumstances have allowed the Quad 2.0 to resuscitate itself. But the caveat here is the Quad is just one part of the mosaic. So there are other, you talked about the noodle bowl, maybe we're using the wrong analogy, but there are many different minilaterals, multilaterals. ASEAN hasn't come up much at all in this discussion, but is a part of this. As frustrating as ASEAN can be, we all love our ASEAN friends, but it can be a difficult forum. All of these things are part of it, and the Quad is one simple part of it. But quickly to get back to Thibaut's really good question about connecting this also to Europe. One example, and Akiko, I think you mentioned this with the seas and the importance of trade, but getting more specific on commodities and specifically on energy. So most of the energy supplies, and China relies on this too, to South Korea and Japan come from the Middle East, traverse through the South China Sea. So if the pain that our European friends are going through now with the war, Russia's illegal war in Ukraine, is felt very acutely, just think of what the pain will be like if the cost of LNG contracts are going up because you have two potential conflicts and you have the large economies of Northeast Asia who are also energy strapped and are facing those circumstances. So this will be a direct economic cost to European friends as well if we get into that situation. So that's something that can be more visceral and you can feel. It does seem far away, but trust me, you will feel it in your pocketbooks.
On that point, let's get to this question about anxiety, about a sort of hawkishness on China. I'm sure, yeah, Bobo, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, there's plenty to criticize in Chinese foreign and security and economic policy. God knows, I'm not trying to defend China, but there is a real issue, and there's certainly a big perception in Europe that no matter what Beijing does, it's in the wrong. So it never gets credit for anything that it does even halfway right, and it gets slagged off for absolutely everything. And I think Macron's admittedly unfortunate remarks reflected that sentiment, that the idea, in the sense of China can do no right. And that makes European leaders like Macron and also Scholz uncomfortable. Because the problem with not discriminating between good and bad behavior or less bad behavior is that it means that it loses any sort of meaning, any proportion. And if you're trying to sort of sell Western policies to the global South, for example, then it just looks unfair. That what really you don't care about norms and values and principles. They're just fig leaves. Ultimately, in the case of the United States, you care about global strategic primacy. Now, whether that's fair or unfair, the point is that it's perceived to be indiscriminate and unfair, not just across much of Europe, but clearly in the non-West more broadly.
Let me push you for an example. What's an example of something that China has done right, that it should have gotten credit for and that it didn't?
Okay, I don't think it got much credit for facilitating the Saudi-Iranian rapprochement. Now, what the Americans said was it was already on its way. And no doubt that was true. But I think they could have been slightly more gracious in that. Another area of criticism is when Joe Biden took a cheap shot at Xi Jinping not turning up to the Glasgow COP26 summit. No, it didn't. He said, we're here, this is US showing leadership. Xi Jinping is meanwhile back in Beijing. It shows that China's not ready for leadership. That's a cheap shot, because he knows full well the reasons why Xi Jinping was back in Beijing. God knows there's plenty to criticize about China. So let's be more selective, because our criticisms of Chinese bad behavior will have infinitely more impact if we are discerning.
Right. Matt, do you want to weigh in on this? I'm curious. I imagine you might have some thoughts. We have just about 10 seconds, quickly.
Yeah, sure. I mean, just to bring it back to Europe also, I think, it's an Indo-Pacific issue, and this is where we started. It's also a broader global issue. But I think the frame for understanding all of these security questions that might resonate with Europeans as well is that there really is tension between goals of liberalism and illiberalism that are on the line here. So, China's view, it's true that China's global strategies are, in a sense, contentless, but they are also contentless in the sense that they do not value or promote liberalism abroad. That's not China's model. And so, whether it's the Indo-Pacific, whether it's the global South, China's goal is not to promote values that are the bedrock of the EU, basically. And that's an issue that has to be worked out. That's where it is.
Thanks for bringing us back to where we started. Yeah. Thank you all so much. This was really illuminating. Thank you to the audience for some great questions. And thank you to the conference organizers once again. And now we can go eat.
That was fun.